to me. Please, there's not a lot of time. Listen. I love you. I will always love you. Dawn, the hardest thing in this world is to live in it.
As we all know by now, Buffy the Vampire Slayer is being greenlit for a pilot at Hulu, with Chloe Zhao of The Eternals as lead director and Nora and Lil Zuckerman of Poker Face the core writing team. In a previous video linked below, we go into as much detail as we can covering everything we know about the show so far, including which actors will likely be coming back to reprise their roles. In this video, we're going to offer our opinions on why the Buffy reboot will almost certainly fail. I've already covered some of the more obvious reasons why the reboot won't work in the previous video, such as the fact that Joss Whedon won't be working on the project and that some of the actors who are meant to be playing 20-year-old vampires are now in their 60s. So if you're interested in those topics, feel free to click on over to the other video. But here in this video, we'll be covering a topic that's been the plague of Hollywood, and arguably of Western society as a whole, for the past decade or so. Namely how the insertion of current-day far-left ideology damages everything it touches and will almost certainly do the same to Buffy. As we've seen time and time and time again over the past few years in film, TV, comic books and games, the presence of this ideology in media, what the Critical Drinker succinctly calls
the message,
has an almost 100% success rate of making the resultant product absolute dog shit. So, without further ado, let's get political. Be warned, this is a topic which will likely cause every blue-haired sociology student and male feminist nice guy to tremble in their pink pussy hats. In the comment section of my last video, there was some disagreement as to what woke even means. And so I thought I'd spend a little bit more time here giving my thoughts before we dive into exactly what woke means for Buffy specifically. The word woke is used a lot in today's world. Woke. With many reporting that its users don't actually know what it means.
Let's talk about woke, especially and specifically the perversion of the term woke, to the point where the anti-wokists don't even know what they're talking about and what they mean when they talk about woke.
Which is a clever tactic, used consciously or not, of forcing the ideology's detractors into the Sisyphean task of defining the parameters of wokism, despite the landscape of what it means to be woke shifting almost daily, thereby having the effect of keeping the attention on the definition of the ideology, rather than on its goals and impacts. The people who use this tactic are themselves, of course, ubiquitously and unsurprisingly woke. And it's a useful tactic because, as with all ideologies, its focus, language, morality, and even its specific goals change over time. Let's use a quick example to show what I'm talking about. Who would you picture if I were to describe a politician who ran his campaign for president on being anti-illegal immigration, who wants comprehensive immigration reform, who expects that all immigrants should speak English, and who wants to secure the borders by building a wall around Mexico and force illegal immigrants out of the shadows? Was the person you picture by any chance wearing a red cap and possibly too much spray tan? Well, you're correct. This example shows that ideologies are, almost by design, slippery creatures. What is apparently far-right fascism today was the most progressive kind of left-wing politics in 2008.
And they need us to enact comprehensive immigration reform once and for all. We can't wait 20 years from now to do it. We can't wait 10 years from now to do it. We need to do it by the end of my first term as president of the United States of America. And I will make it a top priority in my first year as president, not only because we have an obligation to secure our borders and get control of who comes in and out of our country, not only because we have to crack down on employers who are abusing undocumented immigrants instead of hiring citizens, but because we have to finally bring undocumented immigrants out of the shadows. It is time we did that.
There are several valuable conceptions of what woke is.
So the new popular talking point on the American left is that conservatives can't define the word woke Being woke refers to waking up to invisible alleged societal injustices based on genetically inherited attributes: race, sex, and sexual orientation. And further, it creates a hierarchy based on these genetic attributes to say that you're either an oppressor or you're a member of an oppressed class.
Why would we be falling for this interpretation of society as depending solely or primarily on interest groups based on gender/sex, sexual orientation, race, and a bit more? Why would we be doing that? Why would we be taking the individualism out of individuals?
But let's delve a little bit deeper. The word woke has its modern origins derived from black civil rights in America, but it's morphed in recent years to become far more expansive than was originally intended, as tends to be the case with parasitic ideologies. It merged with the developing social justice activism grown out of academia in the 2000s, and today it's an umbrella term used to describe the plethora of examples of far-left policy and intrusion into daily life. From the belief that everything's a social construct and only power dynamics are really real, to the support for discrimination against certain groups of people.
Am I saying that I hate white dudes? No, I'm not. I do not need a 40-year-old white dude to tell me what didn't work for him about A Wrinkle in Time. It wasn't made for him.
What the hell are you talking about?
To the imposition of some minorities' rights for the mere edification of other minorities.
Leah Thomas, a swimmer on the University of Pennsylvania's women's swim team, has become the first openly transgender athlete to win a Division I NCAA championship.
So it almost felt as if we were going into the race with our hands tied behind our back. I can wholeheartedly attest to the tears that I saw from the 9th and 17th place finishers who missed out on being named an All-American by 1 place. And we raced, and ultimately we tied. We went the exact same time down to the 100th of a second. And so we go behind the awards podium, and the NCAA official looks at both Thomas and myself, and he says, "Great job. You guys tied. We don't really account for ties, so we're gonna give this trophy to Leah." And so I was, of course, taken aback by this. Leah has to hold the trophy for photo purposes. You can pose with this 6th place trophy, but you'll have to give it back. You will go home empty-handed. Leah takes the trophy home.
Another attack on women's rights. A shocking new Scottish government policy will allow trans criminals with a history of violence against women to serve their sentences in female prisons.
At its core, wokeism is the belief that immutable traits such as race, gender, and sexuality should be at the forefront of any individual's identity, that this identity determines how society treats the individual, and thus determines their position in the hierarchy of power. Inevitably, the ideology's conclusion is that equitable practices must be imposed in order to rectify this perceived imbalance. The lower your group is perceived to be on the power hierarchy, the more society must strive to lift you up, while those perceived to be at the top must be dragged down, even in situations where the generalisation clearly doesn't apply. There's a lot more to say on this subject, but to prevent this video becoming 4 hours long on a subject which is not its focus, let's just say that whenever anyone snarkily asks you to define the word woke,
where the anti-wokists don't even know what they're talking about and what they mean when they talk about woke,
we can proceed like Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart when he was asked to define what hardcore meant in relation to porn. I know her when I see her. Obviously, our focus here is about how wokeism, far-left ideology, identity politics, or whatever you want to call it, has infected Hollywood and why this is a death knell for the Buffy reboot. So, why is this such a hindrance? According to the woke themselves, Hollywood and virtually everything it's ever produced has always been political, so it's no different now. It's just that today we have whiny man babies crying about it.
I do not need a 40-year-old white dude to tell me what didn't work for him about A Wrinkle in Time. It wasn't made for him.
If that's comparable to this sort of world, this culture of toxic fandom, where like if you make a movie, especially if you make a superhero movie, like you have great intentions, but there are always going to be a small yet vocal group of people. They're kind of just be toxic.
What has been put out in media throughout history, it's mostly from a cisgendered white male perspective. And so everything that's not that feels a little bit fresher. So it feels like pretty good business. My real plea is for men to have enough empathy to go see movies starring women. Because I've been asked to go see movies starring men my entire life and happily have done so. And I don't know why men don't return the fucking favor.
Part of it was guys who didn't want women playing Ghostbusters.
And according to the first female action star herself, men just can't possibly identify with a female lead.
I remember when I was doing Hunger Games, nobody had ever put a woman in the lead of an action movie because it wouldn't work. We were told girls and boys can both identify with a male lead, but boys cannot identify with a female lead.
Oh, absolutely.
And now the Estrogen Network presents Afternoon Yak.
Man.
Cancelled.
But is that actually true? Way back in the before times, specifically in the 70s, 80s and 90s, we had strong female characters aplenty, yet the mythological basement-dwelling trolls were seemingly nowhere to be found. On the contrary, the franchises which gave rise to all these strong female characters, which as an aside is now a term which rightfully turns our best actresses away from such roles, were predominantly directed towards male audiences. Star Wars, Aliens, Terminator, Xena, Scream, Tomb Raider and Kill Bill were all, for lack of a better term, boy brands. Boys and men supported these films because they told compelling stories with compelling characters. They obviously didn't give a shit that there were badass women involved. In fact, they loved it. These characters, who by the way were all at least co-created by men, are now iconic because men loved them. The idea that men just don't like seeing women or black people or gay people or whichever group because they're bigots just doesn't hold up to even the slightest scrutiny. Even the biggest female-led box office flops were still primarily supported by men, not women. This brings us neatly back to Buffy, which as a concept is clearly feminist in origin. Joss has recalled in many interviews that he was inspired by classic horror tropes, which he then aimed to subvert.
I've always been a huge fan of horror movies, and I saw so many horror movies where there was that blonde girl who would always get herself killed. I started feeling bad for her. I thought, it's time she had a chance to, take back the night. And so the idea of Buffy came from just the very simple thought of a beautiful blonde girl walks into an alley, a monster attacks her, and she's not only ready for him, she trounces him.
Which back in the 90s was actually relatively novel before deconstruction and subversion became every hack writer's go-to. So then what's the problem? Surely one feminist story with a strong female character is basically the same as any other feminist story with a strong female character. After all, they have the same motivations and goals. Well, that's what supporters of the woke movement claim.
The X-Men? Yeah, they've always been woke.
Comics have always been woke.
But then why would we trust people who can't even define or describe what these creatures called women are that they're apparently so concerned about?
So what is a woman?
Why do you ask that question?
So, did the creators of Buffy have the same motivations and goals in creating the show as modern day creators? Let's take a look.
Buffy was always intended to be a role model. And, we're not out to confront issues, we're not out to, to lecture people. But it was very important to me that Buffy be the kind of girl girls could look up to.
Well, I think the beauty of the show is that it appeals to everybody, to show that adults can watch with their children. Young children just enjoy the monsters and the pretty people and the funny jokes. Older teenagers can relate to it, especially females. It's the first time in a long time now the trend is moving towards it. We're gravitating towards these strong female individuals that people can look up to. Buffy is not the smartest in her school. She's not prettiest. She's not the most popular. She's okay with who she is. And it's very important as a teenager that you have someone that you can look up to that's an individual. Because as we all know, high school is not your sheep. You follow the trends, and it's wonderful to learn that individuality is important.
It's clear that, although Joss was inspired by feminist motives, he wanted to create a world where women weren't always the victim at the hands of the monster in the dark alley. He also didn't want to smash the audience over the head with this message. He didn't want to lecture them. Instead, he wanted his underlying message to be just that, underlying, beneath the surface. He wanted his framings to come through in the storytelling and the characters, which he always put front and centre in his works. Let's contrast this method of filmmaking with that of modern-day creators.
You are such a champion for diversity, and you're a woman of color as well, and making sure that there's representation. This superhero team looks like the world. Diversity.
It's amazing. Well, for both of you too, this film has such diversity, such inclusion.
Another the theme is just how diverse this cast is and what they represent. So many people will see themselves represented in it.
It's not the typical cast. Everybody looks different. Everybody sounds different.
Diversity.
A lot of people are going to see themselves as superheroes for the first time.
This cast, it's like a diverse cast of superheroes.
So what I love about being a part of this universe is the diversity and the inclusion. We all are inclusive.
I want to ask you both because this is, I would say, arguably the gayest Star Wars, I think, by a considerable.
So my character, you know, she's a powerful leader. She's a powerful leader. Yes. In a very woman-centered world, which I was very excited to kind of be that, because I feel like Star Wars is very like patriarchal. So it was kind of cool to have like this sort of woman-centered figure.
Agatha is the gayest Marvel project yet. The gayest Marvel project. The gayest Marvel project to date. Do you agree?
It better be.
Yeah.
I think witches are queer inherently just because we are outcast and like set aside for many reasons. And I think this show shows a really good representation of different types of people.
And gayer as each episode goes.
What do you think are some misconceptions about Marvel?
That it's just for like straight white men.
Yeah.
Yes, it will be a gay explosion by the end.
These examples, which, by the way, are the tip of the iceberg, show a radically different approach to film and TV creation compared to what was applied to Buffy. Writers, directors, and actors in the Hollywood landscape of today place identity and the rules of oppression-based power dynamics and victim hierarchies as the central priority when constructing their stories and characters. It's far more important to have a diverse cast who explicitly fight the injustices of today and wear fashionable, progressive ideals on their sleeves than it is to actually tell a good story. And if the previous clips weren't evidence enough, then how about the absolute disaster that is Amelia Perez? The story of a sadistic cartel leader who transitions into a woman only to be forgiven for all his past atrocities by his diverse, progressive confidant. And there's supposedly some singing in there as well, although I'm not convinced that this actually counts.
Hello, very nice to meet you. I'd like to know about sex change operation.
I see. Men to woman, woman to men.
Man to woman.
From penis to vagina.
This absolute lunacy was nominated for 13 Oscars, winning 2 of them. Obviously, the only reason it received so many nominations, joint second in all-time nominations alongside the likes of Gone with the Wind and Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, was because the message was in lockstep with the Academy's sensibilities. And the only reason it didn't win more was because it turns out that both the writer-director and lead star possess opinions that don't really gel with the Hollywood elite after all. So, we've looked at what the people behind the scenes think and believe, but how exactly does this affect the actual shows and films themselves? Let's take a look at some examples one by one before we consider how these effects will inevitably be applied to a modern Buffy show. First, the overwhelming focus on race, gender and sexuality in the modern era has turned what was once a subtle message delivered via a nudge and a wink into an angry, mutated message delivered via a headbutt. Rings of Power, perhaps the most expensive failure ever made, infamously race-swapped characters from Tolkien's books, thereby turning what was once a Northern European mythology into a modern-day cosmopolitan fantasy. Now, you might not have any issue with such a change, it is fiction after all, but such relatively minor changes can have big implications for characters and world building. For example, if Rings of Power is a prequel to Lord of the Rings, which it clearly is in every way except legally, then where did all the black and brown hobbits, elves and dwarves go? The race changes suggest that somehow, at some point before the Lord of the Rings occurs, all non-white individuals from every population were systematically eradicated. But such issues with world building are nothing compared to the impact such focus on race and gender can have on character writing. In the original Mulan quickly realises she's not as fast or as strong as the male soldiers, and so needs to use her intelligence, cunning and work ethic to keep up with them, thereby endearing the audience to her via her efforts. In the modern remake, however, Mulan instead had always possessed power far greater than those around her, and therefore didn't need to learn any lessons or really struggle at all. Instead, she started off powerful, became more powerful, and her only arc was that she came to believe in herself. In Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness, America Chavez is the most uniquely powered individual in the multiverse, able to do what no one else can, And once she learns to believe in herself, she can even take down the Scarlet Witch with relative ease. Captain Marvel was the most powerful known entity in the MCU, up until the introduction of Gaia, of course. And the only thing holding her back were the men who said she wasn't good enough. That is, until she learned to believe in herself. Monica Rambeau learned to fly via black girl magic, which seems to be the black female version of believing in oneself. Now, if you've paid extremely close attention, you might have been able to discern a really quite subtle pattern here, but in case you didn't, let me spell it out. Almost all women are maximally powerful, and the only flaw they possess is that they don't believe in themselves enough. This is a trope that's become so common that you can predict with near perfect accuracy how every story involving a female protagonist is gonna go. This is what the anti-woke crowd rightfully call the Mary Sue. Women, and sometimes men, who are essentially all-knowing, all-powerful beings without flaws, except for the notable lack of belief in oneself. These perfect angels can do no wrong, and this brings us onto our final point. Boring characters and problems with world building are, I think, the least of our worries. We also need to consider how morality has been absolutely warped in modern day characters whom the writers believe to be of an oppressed class. In the Marvels, we learn that Captain Marvel has created the conditions to commit genocide against an entire planet, and despite having the power to save them, simply left them to their fate. In WandaVision, Wanda is affirmed in her crimes by Monica Rambeau and the show itself, despite the fact that she literally kidnapped and tortured men, women and children for months on end. She was also let off the hook by Doctor Strange. In Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Sam literally sides with and defends terrorists who've murdered innocent civilians. While in Black Widow, Natasha and Yelena kill hundreds if not thousands of men, many of whom were innocent guards, while Melina is completely forgiven for her role in the kidnapping, torture, trafficking and exploitation of thousands of girls. In Wonder Woman 1984, Wonder Woman rapes a man and... you know what? Let's just leave it there. I could go on all day, but if I haven't made the point effectively by now, then I never will.
How do you write women so well?
I think of a man, and I take away reason and accountability.
My overarching point here is that these Mary Sues aren't just physically overpowered, they're also morally overpowered. Nothing they ever do could be called out or criticised in any substantive fashion by the show or by relatable, high-status characters within the show. And focusing on diversity for diversity's sake can have massive, unintended consequences across the board for all elements of storytelling. And in my experience, these consequences are rarely, if ever, positive. We've heard a lot in recent years how films and shows need to be updated for so-called modern audiences.
We're bringing a modern edge to it.
I just mean that it's no longer 1937, and it's
not going to be saved by the prince.
She's not going to be dreaming about true love. She's dreaming about becoming the leader she knows she can be.
Future of filmmaking, what are you the most excited about and what are you the most afraid of?
I'm most excited for like 19-year-old queer kids with cameras to do some cool punk shit. Least excited for 40-year-old straight men with cameras and lots of money to do boring shit.
Same. We have the opportunity to tell a new Indiana Jones story for a modern gaming audience.
About that diversity and the representation.
Representation.
La representación. Representaciones. En la representación. Representaciones. Representation.
Representations. Represent. Representation.
I'm a piece of representation in gaming and see representation on the big screen and to feel represented.
Represented.
Represent.
Representation.
Represented. They're representing.
Representing.
This representation.
Exciting, right?
I mean, it's not something that we do because it's a political move, but it's because is really good for the story.
So many people are going to feel themselves represented in this.
It's too white, our television and movies.
And so presumably the same will also be true of Buffy. Now, some commented on my last video arguing that the original Buffy was woke anyway, but I hope to have already shown how this is absolutely not true. Buffy was a show which explored how mostly ordinary people react to extraordinary circumstances, and how life is better when faced head-on alongside family and friends. Buffy was arguably the most successful Slayer in history, but that wasn't because she was the strongest or the fastest, and it certainly wasn't because she was a Mary Sue. It was because she'd cultivated relationships which kept her safe, and which gave her something worth fighting for. The fact that the lead was a powerful woman, or that her best friend discovered that she was attracted to other women, was almost entirely inconsequential to the plot and to the personalities of the characters. So to make this point as explicit as I can, we're going to end this video by looking at what woke Buffy made for a modern audience would have actually looked like. In terms of story, we would never have gotten the focus on the building of friendships and allegiances in order to fight the forces of darkness. No. Instead, every plotline would have been dripping with sanctimonious current-day politicking. There would be no good guys and bad guys, unless the bad guys were straight white men, obviously.
Here are our best examples. Meet guy who calls women it.
There's a hot chick over there. I'm gonna go talk to it.
Meet guy who doesn't care about a woman's career.
So what do you do?
I'm a lawyer. I just started at a firm downtown, GLK&H.
Meet guy who expects the woman to pay.
Thank you so much for the drinks.
Yeah, for sure.
Hey, we should do this again.
Meet guy who calls a woman a specimen.
What a specimen.
Meet guy who would literally rather die than have a difficult conversation with a woman. Meet guy who doesn't understand the definition of alone.
I hate to see two stunning women sitting all alone.
The one guy that isn't terrible on the show is named Pug. Wonder where his leash is, because he's a harmless little lapdog, clearly.
No wonder men are so desperate to hold onto their power. This is the easiest ever. As a guy, I can do anything.
So sick of rich guys like you, not only not realizing how much is handed to them, but still thinking they're the victims when they mess everything up because of their lazy entitlement and fragile egos.
Instead, there would be characters and groups who by any conventional standard would be evil, but whom the show would deem morally ambiguous, ambivalent, or even morally just.
Terrorists only set us back a bit.
You have to stop calling them terrorists. But you have no idea how complicated this situation is. You know what? You're right. You've got to do better, Senator.
She's holding thousands of people hostage.
And it could have been thousands more if she hadn't put up her own quarantine.
They'll never know what you sacrificed for them.
Well, I knew sooner or later you'd show up wanting to discuss what happened at Westview. I made mistakes, and people were hurt.
But you put things right in the end, and that was never in doubt.
For our star Slayer, Buffy would no longer be a complex, nuanced character with strengths and flaws, being simultaneously strong, socially competent, and loyal while also being flighty, academically average, and naive. Instead, she'd be a badass girl boss whom the show frames as indisputably perfect, even in situations in which she's being anything but.
They'll never know what you sacrificed for them.
She'd also likely be an entitled, unbearable arsehole who never stops moaning and forever blames all her woes on men.
That's the thing, Bruce. I'm great at controlling my anger. I do it all the time. When I'm catcalled in the street, when incompetent men explain my own area of expertise to me, I do pretty much every day, because if I don't, I will get called emotional, difficult, or I might just literally get murdered.
The suit is literal perfection.
It will be. When it fits a woman.
I'm not about to let a man take credit for a woman's work.
Where is that candy man? I mean, candy person. It could be anybody, even though we both definitely know it's a man.
No wonder men are so desperate to hold onto their power. This is the easiest ever. As a guy, I can do anything.
I'd punch you if men didn't sexualize women fighting.
Yes, we know. We know everything.
Do you know nothing? It's a shame you're not a woman anymore. She'd have understood.
We've got all that power, but there is a way to get rid of it.
Something a male-presenting Time Lord will never understand.
For Willow, instead of her having one of, if not the most complex and expansive arcs in the entire Buffyverse, developing from a timid nerd into perhaps the most powerful character in the show, her entire story and personality would undoubtedly revolve almost entirely around her same-sex attraction. She would be gay, and gay would be her identity, her personality, her every thought, and her reason for being.
That lesbians were good at solving crimes. It's like the one positive stereotype perpetuated by cop shows.
This away from him. Them. What?
Me.
What?
I'm them.
Because the doctor's
Male and female. And neither. And more.
Or they'd simply race swap her, as weirdly seems to happen to almost all redheads in modern media. Finally, we come to the bottom of the barrel in modern media: straight white men. These would have undoubtedly been almost universally disparaged and disregarded as stupid, ignorant, arrogant, and selfish people who could never understand the struggle of women or ethnic minorities. By dint of their skin colour, sex, and sexuality, characters such as Xander, Giles, Angel, Spike, and Wesley would have been treated as fodder for the more diverse members of the cast to insult and criticise.
But the position of Santa has mostly been a white man's game.
Exactly, it's fucking crazy. Things have gotta change.
An R-rated animated Christmas comedy with a touch of a feminist agenda.
Being yourself in public is a very white thing to be able to do.
What's the most dangerous animal on the planet?
Sharks.
White people.
Or else they would have simply been gender or race swapped as well. All of these biases, which flat out did not exist in the original show, cause writers, directors, and actors to force storylines and character arcs to fit within the bounds dictated by the ideology. Baddies can only be truly evil if they're straight white men. If they're women or ethnic or sexual minorities, they must be morally ambivalent or at least have a just cause for their actions. This is a recipe for a terrible show with a predictable plot and boring, unlikable characters, as has been the fate of virtually every mainstream film and show to come out of Hollywood in the past few years. Before we go, since news of the Buffy revival came out, it's pretty much fully captured my attention to the neglect of other content, and moving forward will likely be no different. Although other reviews and commentary will be making their way out over the coming weeks, I am also currently working on a response to Cosmo Variety Hour's video, in which he calls Xander the worst TV character ever. So if that sounds like something you think you'd be interested in, be sure to stay tuned. If you like this video in any way, shape or form, please feel free to like, subscribe, and all that good stuff. See you in the next video. Ta-ra.